the emphasis on men's emotional life runs the risk of being another exercise of men's privilege to take up space. Such a discourse of masculinity as an identity politics for men also tends to be behavioralist, framing violence as what men do, a set of actions and decisions that can be modified. It tends to be exceptionalist, regarding men's violence as an aberration from a healthy, non-violent society, a rupture within a peaceful order. And it tends to be culturalist, looking to the solutions for men's violence within culture and society, redefining what it means to be a man, changing the cultural script of masculinity such that it does not rely on violence. The notion that it is violence that connects doing masculinity with being a man informs much of the current debates about what to do about men's violence. If social cultural constructions of masculinity are identified as the place to look in which to understand men's violence, then ending men's violence requires a new construction. As violence researcher Laurie Heiser wrote some 10 years ago, "The more I work on violence against women, the more I become convinced that the real way forward is to redefine what it means to be male." While there are many nuanced accounts of the social construction of gender that note that men are not simply empty vessels awaiting a new definition, their masculine socialization to be poured in, and that they are active agents in constructing masculinity as well as being constructed by it, little attempt is often made to explain how or indeed why this iterative process works. Questions about why men do act out the violent masculine norms to which they are said to be subject, or why some men in some situations do not, are rarely posed. The workings of the masculinity construction are rarely explored, and the issues of men's interests in their gender privilege gets lost, as does the question of why and how some men resist or deviate from these norms. Indeed, the norms of masculinity tend to be assumed rather than investigated. Some commentators have noted the danger of a circular and self-fulfilling proposition. This view of gender as performance, with its emphasis on gender roles and gender scripts, has been characterized as the gender display model. As McMahon points out, the gender display model relies on shared values, on norms and expectations about what counts as an appropriate gendered performance. It has nothing to say about the ways in which norms are produced. By treating norms as a given, a kind of external input to the model, all it can do is point to the ways in which behavior is said to reflect norms. This can become circular. We discover what norms are by watching behavior, and then discover that behavior reflects norms. Through this emphasis on masculinity as the roles men are expected to play, relations between the sexes can be anesthetized as simply differences between roles, as if it so happens that his role is to be assertive and hers to be submissive. Thinking power is impossible in this framework, but thinking clearly about power has to be central to an effective public policy response to men's violence. Yet this can be impeded rather than aided by the framing of men's violence in terms of a problem of masculinity. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the frequent recourse to an account of multiple masculinities and the relationship between its hegemonic and subordinate varieties. In its original usage as defined by Connell, hegemonic masculinity is the configuration of gender practice which embodies the currently accepted answer to the problem of the legitimacy of patriarchy. Its utility appeared to lie in making room for the reality that gender is about hierarchical relations between men and not simply between men and women. In turn, this has opened up possibilities for engaging men in a project to achieve a more just gender order. But this more nuanced account of the workings of the gender order for men has become conflated with the attempt to use the plural concept of masculinities to account for differences in power and status between men. Rather than talk directly about capitalism and class exploitation, there is talk of a transnational business masculinity and working class masculinities. In the US, there is a growing tendency to frame issues of racism for men in terms of something called black masculinity. In a disturbingly patriarchal centering move, all relations of power and oppression are gathered together within the rubric of masculinity, and the hegemony of ruling elites is in danger of being reduced to a gender construction. at the same time as resistance to class exploitation and racism, to name only two, is at risk of being confined to the effort to reconstruct a different masculinity. Relations of power and domination get framed in terms of gender, the hegemonic masculinity of white ruling class men at the heart of empire, at the same time as issues of gender get framed in terms of identity. But in order to think clearly about men's violence, it is imperative to make distinctions between the workings of power and the workings of gender, between, if you like, hegemonic men and hegemonic masculinity. Unless we do make these distinctions, it's hard to have a conversation about men's material interests and why dominance and submission are the primary signifiers of gender. Might this not result from the male power to enforce such definitions? Unless we do make distinctions about the workings of power, it is hard to have a conversation about the functions of violence in relation to these material interests, as both the expression and exercise of men's domination. Unless we do, it's hard to talk about the functions of violence within interlocking systems of oppression and circuits of power and domination. As Montoya says with reference to men's violence against women in Nicaragua, violence in couple relationships is a problem of power and control. It's maintained by the social structures of oppression in which we live, based among others on gender, class, age, and race inequalities. Or as Ito Ruri writes with reference to the testimony of surviving military comfort women from a dozen Asian nations from the Pacific War of the mid-20th century, it is pointless to view women ahistorically or to attempt to discuss patriarchal domination as if it were separate from nationalism and colonialism. And unless we have conversations about men's violence in these contexts, it becomes hard to talk in more complex ways about violence and accountability, and violence and injustice. Rather than masculinities, I would prefer to be a part of more discussion of accountabilities. This is a discussion of the processes and structures we can envisage that could demand institutional as well as individual accountability, that could call to account not only the men who do the violence, but the men and male-dominated institutions responsible for the policies and decisions that do the violence, the structural violence named by Geltung so many years ago. So what are the opportunities that these thoughts present? Changing the conversation about men and violence to take account of material interests and the functions of violence, as well as systems of oppression, the nature of accountability, and the pursuit of justice, has several implications for public policy responses to men's violence. The first is to address violence and men's relationship to it, not simply in terms of a series of discrete acts, but rather as a set of relations and practices that in part constitute the worlds in which we live. Feldman's term formations of violence seems useful in this regard, speaking both to that which uses, forms violence, and that which is produced by, formed by violence. With respect to work with men, the task is then to recognize their multiple locations within such formations of violence, and what this means personally in terms of their accountability for their own attitudes and behaviors, and politically in terms of the violence that has formed their world and the kind of world that they want to help